Hello Pixies, and welcome to or back to my channel. It's Zoe here, and today I have for you the start of a new series which I'm really excited about, and that is, are these books comparable? Now, you might be asking, what does that necessarily mean? And for me, this series means a very specific idea, and that is, when I love a book, or am really interested in like a certain aspect of a book, I want to read the same thing again, but different. And I want to find books that are like the books that I love. But that can be a kind of tricky thing to do. Obviously, if a book series is really popular, there'll be many articles online detailing books to read if you liked this very popular series. Like we see it a lot with A Court of Thorns and Roses, and there might be series with like Fourth Wing and Percy Jackson and all the big named fantasy books of our time. I'm sure also classics like Lord of the Rings and The Chronicles of Narnia, and even more modern classics like The Wheel of Time. But the books that I want to capture the same feelings aren't usually these big, popular, everyone reads them type books, but I still want to find things that are similar. And so earlier this year, I read Guardians of the Dawn Sahara, and the second book hadn't come out yet. I haven't read the second book yet, so no spoilers. But the second book hadn't come out yet. And I went on Goodreads to go look to see when the second book was coming out. And while I was on Goodreads, I noticed a feature which is readers also enjoyed. And these are books that are supposedly that people enjoyed this book if they read the book that is pulled up, in this case Guardians of the Dawn Sahara. And so I've looked through it, and one of the books that I noticed on there was A Study in Drowning by Ava Reed, and I haven't read that one yet, but it doesn't seem in any way, shape, or form like it is the same type of storytelling or vibe, for lack of a better word, as Guardians of the Dawn Sahara. And so while this book isn't testing books that are like Guardians of the Dawn Sahara, I am planning on doing that one at some other point, but that is unfortunately not where we're starting. It was planned to be the start, but unfortunately it just didn't work out to be that way. That we're going to start out with episode 1 is The Magician's Daughter by H.G. Perry. If you haven't seen my video talking about books to get to know me, then I'll tell you a little bit right here that The Magician's Daughter is one of my favorite books of all time. And I actually recently reread this book just a couple of weeks ago, and I absolutely loved it even on the second go around, which just shows it is truly a favorite book of mine. And so today we're going to test if the books that I recommended on Goodreads, if they're actually comparable to The Magician's Daughter. And obviously I can't read every single book that's recommended if you like this book, so I'm just choosing a selection out of the books provided to see if any of them fit the vibe, but I'm trying to go for different things for each of them. But let's start off with a little synopsis of The Magician's Daughter. The Magician's Daughter follows Biddy, and Biddy has lived on High Brazel her entire life with her guardian Rowan and his familiar Hutchincroft. This is a magical island that's hidden from the mortal world's eyes except for every 7 years. But Rowan goes to the mainland at night in raven form, but he always returns by morning, even though this worries her. One night, he doesn't come back. And so Biddy must set out on an adventure to the real world where she has never been before and be tested by secrets and magic and people who want to do it harm and good, and also confront that the real world isn't what she always thought it would be. And it is absolutely a breathtaking and emotional read. However, I would not describe this as a very atmospheric book. I would say it's very character and plot driven. There's not a lot of emphasis on atmosphere or environment, and it's not very description heavy. And that's what makes this book. And so we're going to see going forward with these other books that I recommended, if you like The Magician's Daughter, if they have the same kind of feel. This is also more of a historical fantasy that is set in our world, is not set in a different world, and regular people don't know the existence of magic. That's another very important part So we're going to see if these books that I'm going to be reading in this vlog are actually comparable to The Magician's Daughter by H.G. Parry. And the first book that we're going to start with, and that I'm going to start reading today, is The Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill by Rowena Miller. There's no magic on Prospect Hill, but there isn't anywhere else either. However, the Fae realm, that exists alongside our realm is magical. And the people of Prospect Hill used to do small fairy bargains with the people of the Fae. But as time has gone on, the world has become more and more modernized, and people have forgot about these bargains and about the Fae, except for our main character's family. But they just do the small little bargains that they always have. However, when the main character's sister marries a man who is not all that he has cracked up to be, she must call in a very large bargain. And I am back. Sorry if the angle has changed. My battery died, which is so like me. But as I was saying, I noticed that H.G. Parry blurbed the front of the Fairy Bargains of Prospect, and it's right on the front. It's marketing, and that got me curious because it's also on the back of this one, but it got me curious. So I went to look at the blurbs on The Magician's Daughter, and on the back, Rowena Miller blurbed this book. So now I'm wondering, are the books on Goodreads blurbed by other authors and they're all being connected this way? Is it people who have just read these books happen to read these books and also rated them highly? With some other books I was researching, like the ones for Guardians of the Dawn Sahara, is because these books came out in a similar time frame? Or is it because these books are actually similar? And that is what I'm going to be finding out in this series. However, being said, this book does really intrigue me, and it does have that historical fantasy vibe, and I'm very interested by the blurb. And also, both these covers have a more vintagey feel, if that makes sense. I'll hold them up side by side so you can see. Looking even like, obviously they're not exactly the same, but I don't think you would bat an eye if you saw them together on a shelf, especially this way. And they're also like the exact same size, like, it's kind of strange. But I'm going to be starting The Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill. Also, I want you to know, with the series going forward, I will be doing books that I liked or loved. I won't be really doing this with books I didn't enjoy, because why would I want to find a book that's similar if I didn't really enjoy the book? Usually I would open up, because I would have opened this book and I would have read a few pages or a chapter of the said book that I'm going to read to make sure I really know the vibes. However, I did just reread this one very recently, so I don't really feel the need to do that because it's still very fresh in my head because of that reread. So I will really get the sense if this is at all comparable to The Magician's Daughter. And I will tell you the other books that I will be reading as we get through the books. But first, I'm going to read this before I talk to you about the next book. Alright. I'll see you when I see you. Hello, it is update time. I am over halfway through The Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill. To be exact, I'm on page 262. And I have some thoughts so far. And that is, I would place this on the lower end of fantasy. If you are looking for a fantasy book and you are a fantasy reader lover, this is very light on the fantasy. Up until this point, some stuff is happening that I think is going to make things a little bit more magical. But for the most part, this is on the lower end of fantasy. This is a low fantasy book, not high fantasy. I wouldn't really describe The Magician's Daughter to be high fantasy either, but it is more of a fantasy book than this. I also want to mention about this book is written in a different style than The Magician's Daughter. The Magician's Daughter is told through the perspective of a young girl on the cusp of adulthood, and she's a little naive, but she does know things. She knows magic. In this book, you're following some older women in a more historical setting, unlike Biddy, it is like historical setting, but it's more about the magic that has been created, the secret society of magic, and her living on High Brazel. In this book, this is very much set in like the real world, and with real world women's problems, and they're older women, so there isn't this sense of like innocent or naiveness, and that goes along with the writing style, and that this is written a bit more stiff than perhaps what us fantasy lovers have gotten used to. Not to say that is bad. I have enjoyed myself immensely. I'm kind of surprised on how much I am enjoying this book, despite it being on the lower end of fantasy, because I am a fantasy reader through and through. And also, while I can't say a lot of big events have happened in this book, like I really can't say big events have happened in this book, I haven't wanted to put the book down either. I only put down the book to go to bed last night. I haven't picked it up again today, but I am planning to. So, on how similar it is to Magician's Daughter, I would say there's some pretty big key main differences, from the writing style to the emphasis on atmosphere to like the messages of the story. Because this one, magic is a dangerous thing and doesn't really quite do what you want. And in The Magician's Daughter, magic is this good force that makes the world better, and it's a much more hopeful story than this one. And this one deals with some darker topics than The Magician's Daughter. If you don't want to read about domestic abuse, you do not pick up this book. You can pick up The Magician's Daughter, though. That does not deal with that topic. Does not deal with that topic like this book does. And this is more so real people than it is fantasy, if that makes sense. And also, I think the back, like the description, is a little bit misleading, because as I said earlier on in this video, it implies that one sister is going after the other sister's husband and like going to go on this like big quest to make this big bargain to make sure her sister is okay. But in reality, she's not going on a big quest or anything, and she doesn't think things through, and she's kind of an impulsive protagonist and thinks that she knows better even if she doesn't, and makes decisions for people that people don't want, and in fact might have made things actually worse, like much worse at the end of the day. And I don't like it how on the back they play it that she'll do anything for her sister and it's all for her sister. Like, yeah, she did some of it for her sister, but she also did some of it for herself, and it's ending up like biting her in the ass, like, to be totally clear. But the similarities between this and The Magician's Daughter is that it is a more historical setting. This one's more historical than The Magician's Daughter, but it is still, they both have a historical fantasy type vibe. This one's more historical realism with a touch of fantasy. That one's more fantasy historical, if that perhaps makes sense to you. Also, I'm sorry if it's a little dark. It is a little cloudy, but what can I do? If I turn on this light, it's going to be super yellow, and no one, and I mean no one, wants that. Anyway, it's like that with this. And also, there is the fae in both of them. There are fairies in both of them, and they're more people that you don't like, a kind of being that are kind of mysterious and work in ways that we don't understand. There's both of that in these are more character focused stories. That is also what it has going for it. Like, the feel of the magic is really what makes The Magician's Daughter. That magic is this good force that makes the world better, and Biddy's whole journey is about that, and about accepting like who she is and what she can do and all these things, even though she doesn't have any magic of her own. And that is not how it's portrayed in this. Like, even what the fae does, it's not really described as magic. It has boundaries, and they're not written very plainly, because obviously the fae are tricksters. And that's why, like, so far in this book, and I think my consensus overall is going to be that this book is a good book, but I don't know if I can say that this has any of the similar comparisons that give me the same feeling as The Magician's Daughter gives me. And the whole purpose of this series is to find like what books are actually similar and what books, you know. I don't think this is a bad recommendation if you like The Magician's Daughter, but you have to go into understanding that the world and the writing and the feeling and the characters aren't necessarily similar, and all it really has going for it is that the fact that they're both character-driven stories with a more historical setting. I feel like I'm rambling a bit. This is my first time. I'm doing my best. I'll get better as I go with how to describe how books are similar or not similar to the books they're being compared to. But I also want to point out, I'm pretty sure these are the same publisher. I know I should go get the book and go see it, but I want to point out in the back of this book is the first chapter of The Magician's Daughter. Like, it's right there. Can you see? Like, the first chapter of The Magician's Daughter is in the back of this book. So I'm like, Are these just being like marketed heavily so much by this company that's just like, if you like this, you'll like that, that's like made its way into Goodreads? I am enjoying it. Neither Elaine or Delphine I can really say are characters that I really enjoy, that I like. You know, we're all doing our best here. I'm gonna finish this book today because I am enjoying reading it, but this isn't a new favorite book. Like The Magician's Daughter is one of my favorite books, and this isn't a new favorite, and that's also part of the series, is me trying to find new favorites, because I'm only doing this series with books that I consider to be like favorites, or books that I really, really, really enjoy, or books that I want to find again, but maybe even better. I can see why people could compare it to The Magician's Daughter, but I think if you're looking for the same feeling as The Magician's Daughter, this doesn't quite do it. See if I'm proven wrong. Maybe this last about like 120 pages will make me change my mind, but I feel like I could tell almost from the very first chapter that this isn't quite the same. But anyways, after that, I'll just tell you my final thoughts, I guess, even though I feel like I said a lot of thoughts. Maybe I'll cut it out and do it later. But I'll tell you my final thoughts, and if I think you should pick it up if you enjoyed The Magician's Daughter. I feel like I already did that. I'll tell you my final thoughts in a bit after I finish, and I'll tell you the next book that we're gonna try. So I'll see you then. I have officially finished the Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill, and I've got to say, those last like 120-ish pages of this book were probably my favorite. So that last 120 pages, it does get a bit more magical, which is what I'm into, but overall I wouldn't really say this is like super fantasy. Like obviously there are fantasy things happening with these fairy bargains, but it gets a whole lot more real at the 120 page mark. And honestly, these last pages had me appreciating both of the main characters more, even though they're not really my favorite kind of character. I wouldn't say any of the characters feel like characters from The Magician's Daughter. I think they're very, very different. I wouldn't say this is written in the same way as The Magician's Daughter. I wouldn't say that the magic and the other world, for lack of a better term, feels the same. I can see why people make the comparison, because they are both historical based fantasies, but in my opinion, the Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill doesn't really feel the same as The Magician's Daughter. However, I don't think it's a bad recommendation if you like The Magician's Daughter. At the same time, I'll probably put it at like a so-so level. It's not a great recommendation if you love The Magician's Daughter, but it's also not a bad one, if that makes sense. So I'm just gonna leave it at that for the Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill. I'll tell you the next book I'm going to read, but I'm not going to start it today. So I'll just talk about the next book when I start it, and I'll see you then. Hello. It's a new day, and that means it is a new book to continue on this episode. And the next book I have is Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. And my cat has gotten to this book. It's a little beat up. Will live. But this is Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. And I was surprised to see this book on here because I don't really believe this is a fantasy book. I believe this is more of I don't want to say it's horror, but like I don't really know what the genre is, but it's not really reading to me as magical fantasy, but maybe it's more of like a gothic fantasy or something. But we do know the little synopsis of this book is that we are following our main character Opal, and Opal like isn't really doing that well in life. She works part-time as a cashier at a grocery store. She just wants to escape this town that she's living in, and the town that she's living in is known for really only one thing, and that is Starling House, where an author had lived about 100 years ago. They wrote this book called The Underland, but then they disappeared, and now Arthur lives in Starling House, and Arthur is the heir of this author. Like they're their grandchild or whatever. Down the family line, they're related to the person who wrote The Underland, and all her life Opal has been obsessed with with the Underland, with the book. And one day she's offered the opportunity to go to this house that most people really want to leave alone because it's got spooky vibes. I think to work there to earn some extra cash because, as I said, she's a part-time cashier worker. But then things start to go in a way, and I think she starts to feel at home in the Starling house, but there are other things happening as well. I don't really know like the full story. Obviously, I haven't read it all yet. So we have the Starling house as our next book, and I'm very intrigued by this. It doesn't sound anything like The Magician's Daughter to me, but we'll see if there's like a similar vibe in the writing style, similar concepts expressed through the text. We'll see if it's got the same vibe. That's what the video is all about. That's what the series is all about. But I also want to point out an interesting thing that I noticed about the Starling house and about The Magician's Daughter is that actually the little blurb on the front cover of The Magician's Daughter right here on the neck of it, I don't know how well you can really see it, but actually Alex E. Harrow. She wrote about The Magician's Daughter, the most rare and precious thing, a brand new classic, both wholly original and wonderfully nostalgic. And that is what Alex E. Harrow wrote about this story, which is strange because, like I said before, Rowena Miller also blurbed it, and Rowena Miller's book is also a book that was recommended. But when I was looking on Starling House, I didn't see H.G. Perry as a blurb anywhere, so it could just be coincidence at the end of the day, and this is a different publisher than the other books because this one is Tor. The Magician's Daughter is Red Hook, as well as The Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill, so that could also be something to do with it for those two, is that they have similar authors, because similar blurb authors, because that's who they also send the book to, is people in the same publishing house. But this book is Tor, but that doesn't mean every single Alex E. Harrow book is Tor. So we're gonna see if this has a similar vibe. I am excited about it. I will tell you if I like it or not, but the main purpose of this video is to see if this book is actually a good recommendation if you liked The Magician's Daughter, and why or why not. So let's read Starling House. I'll catch you when I have an update on how I'm feeling about this one. I have officially finished Starling House. This book is nothing like The Magician's Daughter, and I mean nothing. So I didn't do like a mid-book check-in because I felt with the last book I said too much at the mid-book check-in and I didn't really have anything new to say for my final thoughts. So I thought I would just pop in when I was finished with this book to tell you my thoughts on how the book compares to The Magician's Daughter, which I've already explained to you at length. This is a paranormal house book with what you could argue is a twinge of fantasy mixed in. And there's a large emphasis on dreams. This book has a lot of allusions to Alice in Wonderland, but make it horror basically. It has a lot to do with history and how history gets warped and turned around over time, and how everyone can tell you different versions of the same event and you don't know what exactly is true at the end. And I think it was all very clever, and I think it was well written and exciting. Those things don't make it like The Magician's Daughter, and the only real comparison that I could even make to The Magician's Daughter is that the main character in this book and the main character in the other book, they both read books, but the characters act nothing alike. Opal, the main character of this book, she is sarcastic, she is a liar, she always comes out on top even though she's always at the bottom at the same time, you know, and like she does things that aren't good, and she's prone to bouts of what I could only call her violence. Like she punches a woman in the mouth at one point, you know, and she is nothing like our main character. And the vibes are completely different because in The Magician's Daughter, magic is inherently a good force. In this book, the paranormal stuff is quite creepy, and the Starling House itself is quite creepy. There's not really any plot similarities. I wouldn't say there's any character similarities. Like this book, it is not the vibe for The Magician's Daughter. If you love The Magician's Daughter and you are looking at this list and trying to be like, what is like The Magician's Daughter? This book is not like The Magician's Daughter, but it is a great book. If you're watching this video and you're like, oh hey, I do like that book, you might like The Magician's Daughter if you want to try something different, because that's more and more of a historical fantasy, and this is a paranormal book with a slight twinge of fantasy hidden inside of it. But really could even argue that's not, honestly, at the end of the day. But it is a dark story. But if you like Starling House, then I would recommend that you read Gallant by V.E. Schwab, because I feel like that is much more of a comparison than this and The Magician's Daughter. I think that's all I really have to say, because there's really no comparisons. And I know with The Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill, I delved way more into like the nuance and being like, it's very close but not quite the same feeling. The Magician's Daughter and The Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill are very close together, and Starling House is leagues apart from both of them in terms of all the things I've already listed, so I'm gonna stop talking about it. Although I did read a very good book at the end of the day. So like, am I disappointed? No, but am I still looking for a book that gives me the same feeling as The Magician's Daughter? Yes. And hopefully the third and final book of this video will be the one that really draws me in. It's like, it gives the same feeling, and I could, without a shadow of a doubt, recommend it if you also loved The Magician's Daughter. I don't have the third book right now. I don't even really know what the third book is going to be. So I'll catch you when I'm reading it. It is a new day, and that means that it's time for the last book of the first episode of the series, and that book is going to be The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence. And now this one is kind of different, because I have the ebook version from Libby, because I don't own this book. I don't own any of the other books that were recommended. And the premise for The Book That Wouldn't Burn is that two strangers somehow wind up meeting when they were never supposed to, and then they have kind of a great adventure, ? And it all has to do with books and libraries. And if you're like, that doesn't really sound like a good description based off the other descriptions you've given in this video, even like the description like on here and for the book itself, it's the same. It's really confusing. Like, I have no idea what to expect by this, and I'm just going to read you it verbatim so you can see why I don't really quite know what to expect going into this book. It says, two strangers find themselves connected by a vast and mysterious library containing many wonders and still more secrets in this powerfully moving first book in a new series. The boy has lived his whole life trapped within a book-choked chamber older than empires and larger than cities. The girl has been plucked from the outskirts of civilization to be trained as a librarian, studying the mysteries of the great library at the heart of her kingdom. They were never supposed to meet, but in the library, they did. Their stories spiral around each other across worlds and time. This is a tale of truth and lies and hearts and the blurring of one into another, a journey of which knowledge erodes certainty, and on which, through the pen may be mightier than the sword, blood will be spilled and cities burned. And if that does not sound amazing, I don't know what to tell you, but now you can see why I had no idea what to really expect from the story, which I actually kind of appreciate. Now, in terms of how I think this could be like The Magician's Daughter, because Starling House was kind of my wild card pick, I really wanted to find a book that really felt like The Magician's Daughter in terms of like the energy of it, and I haven't really quite found that yet in this vlog, so I wanted to find the book that I thought had the best chance of matching that energy. So I chose this one because I feel like them exploring places that they've never known before, both of them maybe being slightly naive, may play into the same vibe as The Magician's Daughter, as well as the love for books and libraries. I think that will also carry over. So I am excited to read this, but I don't know when I'll have either an update or when I'll finish it. It'll probably be a little bit from now. I have this book for 21 days, and honestly, I don't love reading on my cell phone, so I'm not gonna just be able to sit here and just read like I usually do with a physical book. I will update you when I've read a bit more of The Book That Wouldn't Burn, and maybe I can tell you a little bit more what it's about, and that will be what the update is. But I'm excited to get into it. I really have a lot of high hopes for this, so we're gonna see how it works out. So, yeah. I don't know what else to say. Hello, and welcome to the final update of Does It Compare? The Book That Wouldn't Burn really threw me for a loop. Obviously, in the last little segment, you saw me read the description because I found trying to summarize it in mostly my own words was quite difficult, and I didn't know what the book would really be about. But I was very hopeful that we were going to get this very magical adventure with the love and magic of books. That's what I thought it was going to be based off of the description. I can't really say that that's the case, and I thought the book was good, and I enjoyed the book. It wasn't a new favorite, but I enjoyed the book. But at the same time, like, it was kind of disappointing. This book, I can say confidently, without a shadow of a doubt, is anything like The Magician's Daughter. The writing style, completely different. We follow two different characters, so two different voices. Neither one I can really say is comparable to Biddy's voice in The Magician's Daughter. And like the style in general, H.G. Perry's style leans a bit more to whimsy maybe in this one. But like, it just was not like, the tone of the book that went and burned was very serious compared to The Magician's Daughter. And it makes sense because it's a much more serious story, and I wouldn't really call it magical. There are elements that could be like, yeah, that is magical, that is fantasy, but also those same elements might be sci-fi. And if you had to ask me right now, is this a fantasy book or a sci-fi book? I might tell you that this is a sci-fi book, to be completely honest, which is quite strange because I really thought it was fantasy, and I feel like it's marketed as fantasy, but there's technology and stuff, and it's just not really giving me fantasy. It's not really meeting the criteria for fantasy, in my opinion. This was a very high-stakes story. Well, you could argue parts of The Magician's Daughter are more higher stakes. Overall, it's a much quieter, smaller scale story, and this is a big, grand story about this big, grand, never-ending library in the pursuit of knowledge. Way more high stakes. I was not prepared for the level of violence that was in this book. Like, I really was not. You know, the first few chapters, so I don't really feel like it's a spoiler, with our, one of our main characters, like the entire town that she knows, has basically been killed by what they call sabers, and most of the children are kidnapped, including her, and then the sabers that kidnap them get killed by, you know, other soldiers that are on their side, and then they hate them. There's quite a bit of violence throughout the book. Like, it is shaped by violence and war, and I can't really say that I am the biggest fan. Like, I really can't say that. I don't know, like, I feel like I had much more detailed thoughts about the other books. In this one, I am so confused by the ending, and it was so long, and I'm like, why was it so long, that I don't even know what to say about it now, even though I've sat with it and I've thought about it quite often. I still don't really get some parts at the end. It's left me confused. I don't really know if I'm going to continue with the trilogy. I really don't know. Like, I feel like my thoughts on the other books were so much more clear, and then this one's just like, I really don't know. If I had known this book was going to be this way, I probably wouldn't have picked it for this video, because the goal of the video was to find books like The Magician's Daughter. And if I had known about the violence and more of the sci-fi elements, I would have been like, oh, based off the description alone, this is not like The Magician's Daughter. And I already classified Starling House as more of my wildcard pick, so I would have tried to go for something else, maybe like the Book of Gothel, which is in the back of The Magician's Daughter. But I just thought at the time, oh, like, I really want to go for a book that I think is really going to fit the vibe of The Magician's Daughter, and I don't think that's quite it. But at the same time, that proves this like experimental series that I'm doing, is that all these books that are listed underneath, just because people also enjoyed them does not mean that they are like the book that you have pulled up on Goodreads. Despite that, I'm still gonna continue on with the series. I think I read some different things that I wouldn't usually read, and like, I enjoyed them, you know, but did I really find a book that was like The Magician's Daughter? Unfortunately not. I think the closest we came was The Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill, but there were some key differences that didn't match the energy of The Magician's Daughter. I did actually want to do a recommendation based off of books that I've read that I think that if you enjoyed The Magician's Daughter, you would enjoy this book, and the book I have for that is A Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. Now, there are some things that are different, but I would say the vibes of these books are remarkably similar, and if you like The Magician's Daughter, there's almost no doubt of my mind that you would like A Sorcery of Thorns, and vice versa. Both books involve non-magical girls who are immersed into worlds of magic, who also have to save magic in their own ways with his historical fantasy settings. And while the girls themselves might be a little naive to how everything in the world works because they have grown up very isolated, they still want the best for the entire world, not just for themselves. It's my little recommendation. If you love The Magician's Daughter as much as I do, I would say read Sorcery of Thorns, because I think that is the closest book that I can think of that has the same energy as The Magician's Daughter. I'm excited to keep doing these. I'm really inspired by this series. Maybe we'll be more successful in the next episode or different episodes. I think it all just depends on the book. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more, go ahead and subscribe. I'm thinking I'm going to do this series fairly often because it really excites me. I think it has a lot of potential. Give me like book recommendations based on books I already like. And I just wanna, I'm having fun with it. So I guess I'm signing off now. Okay, bye.